Boundary Conditions: What Happens When the American Frontier Becomes a Wall, by Francisco Cantu. On Election Day 2018, residents of Nogales, Arizona, began to notice a single row of coiled razor wire growing across the top of the city's border wall. The barrier has been a stark feature of the town's urban landscape for more than 20 years, rolling up and over hilltops as it cleaves the American town from its larger Mexican counterpart. But in the weeks and months that followed, additional coils were gradually installed along the length of the fence by active duty troops sent to the border by President Trump, giving residents the sense that they were living inside an occupied city. By February, concertina wire covered the wall from top to bottom, and the Nogales City Council passed a unanimous resolution calling for its removal. Such wire has only one purpose: the resolution declared to harm or to kill. It is something, quote, only found in a war, prison, or battle setting, close quote. Living in Tucson, barely an hour north of the border, I have become familiar with both sides of Nogales, crossing over the border to shop, attend meetings, take gifts or supplies to deported friends, or volunteer at a soup kitchen for migrants. In December, as I walked through the pedestrian crossing, I passed by uniformed soldiers transporting long ladders to one side of the port of entry, but I barely registered their significance. The militarization of the borderlands has become so commonplace that one often grows numb to its manifestations. It can seem distant until it reaches out to touch you. Only months later, as I watched images of the concertina wire proliferating on my social media feeds, did I finally understand what those ladders had been for. In The End of the Myth: From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, by historian Greg Grandin, published by Metropolitan, the historian Greg Grandin argues that America's urge to wall off its borders marks the death of our most potent myth, the galvanizing vision of men and women seeking freedom along a vast frontier, a space for reinvention, unburdened by history, and one's own past. Since the very inception of our country, he writes, the presence of a frontier has, quote, allowed the United States to avoid a true reckoning with its social problems, such as economic inequality, racism, crime and punishment, and violence, close quote. The ever-shifting and expanding frontier also acted as a physical barrier against invasion, as a national security buffer against foreign enemies, Native Americans and Mexicans, and as a tenuous escape valve for freed slaves. European migrants and discontented laborers from crowded eastern cities. The frontier did not always have mythic connotations. In early America, the words, quote, frontier, quote, border, and, quote, boundary held little emotional significance and were used interchangeably to describe the physical limits of the nation: the frontier, the border, the boundary. America's first dictionaries didn't even include the word frontier. But as the U.S. government began to coordinate campaigns for the removal and extermination of Native Americans, clearing the way for westward settlers, the meaning of frontier came to be pegged to the notion of civilizational struggle. By the dawn of the 20th century, with Native Americans dwindling in number and largely relegated to reservations, the frontier had been fully transformed into something romantic and beckoning, an entire way of life. It became, Grandin writes, quote, a state of mind, a cultural zone, a sociological term of comparison, a type of society, an adjective, a noun, a national myth, a disciplining mechanism, an abstraction, and an aspiration, close quote. For the dominant white culture, the word meant freedom. The frontier also provided a new way of understanding American identity, history, and politics. At the end of the 19th century, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner announced his, quote, frontier thesis, the idea that, in his words, quote, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development, close quote. American identity hinged upon its perpetual expansion. Our democracy, Turner wrote, quote, came out of the American forest and it gained strength each time it touched a new frontier, close quote. Expansion was thus a fundamental good and an integral part of what sets us apart from Europe. It was the very thing that made America great. But on the frontier, Grandin reminds us, settlers won greater freedom for themselves only by, quote, putting down people of color and then continuing to define their liberty in opposition to the people of color they put down, close quote. The end of the myth, this book we're discussing, aims in part to reposition race-based violence to the center of the frontier narrative, exposing it as foundational to today's border brutalism. In this respect, Grandin's study of the frontier serves as a vital corrective to popular conceptions in the lineage of work by scholars like Richard White, Patricia Limerick, and Richard Slotkin. In a chapter on the Mexican-American War, for example, Grandin unflinchingly describes the savagery of U.S. troops during the conquest of the country's continental neighbor. In one incident, more than 100 Arkansas soldiers descended upon a group of Mexican war refugees in a cave, raping and slaughtering victims as they pleaded for mercy. Many of these rabid army volunteers, Grandin notes, were former bounty hunters with an unchecked thirst for scalping their victims. In passages like this, the end of the myth is effectively in conversation with Cormac McCarthy's seminal novel, Blood Meridian, which follows a band of scalp hunters as they wreak carnage across the borderlands. Indeed, Grandin quotes from the novel, borrows its title for one of his chapters, and even draws on the cover art of the original 1985 edition for his own book jacket, a close-up of one of Salvador Dali's phantom carts, in which a horse-drawn wagon and its occupants become, upon further examination, indistinguishable from the expansive landscape and architecture that surround them. Blood Meridian is propelled by grisly, deeply researched depictions of the violence perpetrated by remorseless white American men, unconcerned with the traumas they were unleashing into history. Long celebrated as a disabused revisionist anti-Western, McCarthy's novel can also be understood as fueling the illusion of frontier masculinity. Grandin, to his credit, rejects the temptation to dismiss the violence as being somehow typical of a particular time or place. The atrocities accompanying expansion are shocking now and were shocking then, even when war-hardened men like General Winfield Scott, the commander of U.S. forces during the Mexican-American War, found them heinous enough to, quote, make heaven weep and every American of Christian morals blush for his country, close quote. A settlement supplanted America's physical frontier. A new project arose to extend manifest destiny beyond its former geographic limits. American imperialism provided the opportunity for a new revolution, Woodrow Wilson declared in 1901, a little more than a decade before ascending to the presidency. During the Spanish-American War of 1898 and ensuing military campaigns in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua, Americans had, in Wilson's view, quote, made new frontiers for ourselves beyond the seas, close quote. Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Spanish-American War. This form of expansion allowed a nation still recovering from the Civil War and Reconstruction to channel its aggression outward once more. Former Confederate soldiers were able to don the uniform of a newly unified country and earn patriotic recognition while still fighting to exert racial superiority over people of color. Letters sent home by soldiers enlisted in these campaigns, Grandin tells us, quote, are notably similar, lightheartedly narrating to family and friends how they would shoot niggers, lynch niggers, release niggers into the swamp to die, close quote. Like those who had collected Native American scalps, first as mercenaries and then as soldiers, these men learned that America's new frontier was a place that could legitimize a racist thirst for violence. For America's leaders, the new age of imperialism also reaffirmed old lessons. Expanding the country's borders beyond the domestic sphere could provide a space to divert anger, resentment, and extremism. Frederick Jackson Turner had recognized that the frontier, quote, was a magic fountain of youth in which America continually bathed and was rejuvenated, close quote. He also recognized that at the end of the 19th century, America was closing in upon itself. But he hoped that the experience of having constructed civilization on a vast frontier would lead to the building of a stable inward society, one rooted in lessons of cooperation, progress, and equality. He failed to imagine that the seductiveness and the convenience of the frontier would instead propel America through a new century of global expansion. As America thrust itself into the wider world, it simultaneously began a process of shoring up its domestic borders. With its entrance into the First World War, the country started to implement race-based quota systems and other immigration controls, culminating in the passage of the National Origins Act of 1924, which excluded all Asian immigrants and sought to ensure that 96% of America's immigration slots were reserved for Europeans. Business interests shielded Mexican migrants from such immigration quotas, but the 1924 Act provided for the formation of the U.S. Border Patrol. The previously irregular and ad hoc policing of the boundary was replaced by a new paramilitary police force that would come to wield extraordinary power along the Mexican border. White supremacists and members of a resurgent Ku Klux Klan saw the nascent Border Patrol as a venue for unchecked brutality, Grandin writes, and they quickly joined its ranks, turning it into a, quote, a vanguard of race vigilantism, close quote. The new agency became the bastion of a Wild West mentality in which patrollers easily imagined themselves as guardians of, quote, frontier forts in hostile territory, holding off barbarians, close quote. The patrol's authority grew in time. Through the 1920s, Mexicans entering the United States had been required to present themselves at official ports of entry, where they were often doused with kerosene by immigration agents and stripped from head to toe to be shaved of their hair in accordance with delousing procedures. It's the 1920s, after this 1924 Act, the National Origins Act. Through the 1920s, Mexicans entering the United States had been required to present themselves at official ports of entry where they were often doused with kerosene by immigration agents and stripped from head to toe to be shaved of their hair in accordance with delousing procedures. To avoid what Grandin aptly describes as a, quote, ritual of abuse, close quote, many migrants simply circumvented border controls by crossing along unmonitored stretches, as they had done for decades before. But in 1929, Congress passed a law introduced by Senator Coleman Blease, an unabashed racist who defended the lynching of black men during his tenure as the governor of South Carolina, that made it a crime for migrants to enter the United States outside official ports of entry, with the newly established Border Patrol providing the muscle for its enforcement. It wasn't long before the Border Patrol began to establish the first significant physical barriers along the Mexican boundary. At the close of the Second World War, 5.8 miles of chain link fencing was erected through Calexico, California, in order to push migrants away from the town's population center and into the rugged and remote desert that surrounded it. This fencing, as the historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez writes in Migra, her indispensable history of the U.S. Border Patrol, that's Migra, spelled Migra, uh, by Kelly Lytle Hernandez. This fencing came from Japanese internment camps that had recently been ordered closed by the Supreme Court. This pattern of repurposing wartime materiel, described as, quote, imperial recycling, close quote, by the political scientist Victoria Hatham, was repeated again at the end of the Vietnam War, when surplus helicopter landing mats were used in the construction of walls along the border in San Diego, Yuma, Nogales, and elsewhere. Grandine's chapters on the Border Patrol make evident the origins of many of today's most egregious border enforcement practices. When I read of the Mexicans who were routinely jeered at by federal agents in the 1920s as they crossed the bridge from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, I thought of the agents who mocked a roomful of crying migrant children last summer after they had been separated from their parents. Aquí tenemos una orquesta, one agent joked. We've got an orchestra here. When I read of the workplace police raids that were conducted in the early 1930s with the sanction of the Hoover administration as a, quote, psychological gesture, close quote, to scare deportable immigrants, I thought of the Show Me Your Papers law passed in Arizona in 2010 and then adopted by other states with the explicit hope of driving migrants towards self-deportation. When I read of the Border Patrol agents who admitted to reporters in the 1970s that when pursuing migrant families, they would often try to apprehend the youngest member first so that the rest would surrender in order to avoid being separated, I thought inevitably of the enactment last year of zero tolerance, which turned family separation into a national policy. Because I served as a Border Patrol agent from 2008 to 2012, Grandine's account brought up more personal memories for me as well. Despite its white supremacist roots, the Border Patrol has evolved into an agency where more than half of its members are of Latinx descent. Just as the military has long promised social mobility to immigrants and minority populations, the Patrol provides rare access to financial security and the privileges of full citizenship, especially for those living in rural border communities. In America, even at the individual level, citizenship politics often wins out over identity politics. Wow. So the author of this piece served in the Border Patrol as an agent from 2008 to 2012, here describing that more than half of its members are of Latino, Latina descent, Hispanic, Chicano, Chicana descent. Uh, just as the military has long promised social mobility to immigrants and minority populations, the military, right, as a way to do that, the Border Patrol provides rare access to financial security and the privileges of full citizenship, especially for those living in rural border communities. So it makes sense you might take a job doing that. In America, even at the individual level, citizenship politics often wins out over identity politics. In America, even at the individual level, citizenship politics often wins out over identity politics. I have to disagree. But I think I'm very isolated in my disagreement there, sir. Nice piece, by the way. We are continuing now. Francisco Cantu in the current New Yorker describing the border with a full history here. As a member of the patrol, I never witnessed anything as straightforwardly depraved as the beatings, torture, rape, and murder Grandine describes. But I often heard romanticized stories of, quote, the old patrol, a lament for the days when agents had free reign across the borderlands, lighting abandoned cars on fire and tuning up smugglers and migrants at will. As young trainees, my colleagues and I were taken to storied places in the desert, a remote past where earlier generations of agents were rumored to have pushed migrants from cliff tops and hidden their corpses. A stretch of road where an agent had run over a Native American lying drunk and asleep on the road. An isolated patch of scrubland where agents had force fed smugglers fistfuls of marijuana and turned them loose to walk through the wilderness barefoot and stripped to their underwear. The forms of violence that I observed and was complicit in were subtler: the destruction of food and water caches, a pervasive attitude of dismissal and neglect, a persistent use of dehumanizing slurs. Grandine's description of a McAllen, Texas police force that came together in the 1980s to gleefully watch highlights of brutal interrogation sessions of migrants called to my mind a day when a senior officer burst into the computer room where I was gathered with a group of junior agents. He interrupted our work to project onto a screen at the front of the room photographs of a body he had just encountered in the desert. In the images, he was squatting with two thumbs up and a broad smile beside a dead man whose flesh had rotted from his bones after months under the unforgiving sun. It was meant to be, as Grandin observes about the videos of the McAllen interrogation sessions, quote, a bonding ritual used to initiate new recruits, close quote. Part of Grandin's achievement in The End of the Myth, by the way, this is all a review, and I'll give you the title again, of The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, by the historian Greg Grandin, published by Metropolitan. Part of Grandin's achievement in The End of the Myth is to situate today's calls to fortify our borders in relation to the centuries of racial animus that preceded them. Donald Trump can be distinguished from his predecessors, Grandin argues, because of his willingness to meet conservative and nativist demands at their logical endpoint, by closing off instead of moving out. By contrast, his predecessors over the past 4 decades each found ways of channeling aggression outward by identifying new frontiers and promising boundlessness in a shrinking world. Reagan pursued anti-communist wars in Central America by declaring it, quote, our southern frontier, close quote. George H.W. Bush saw the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and imagined, quote, new markets for American products, proclaiming that, quote, in the frontiers ahead, there are no borders, close quote. Clinton declared as he signed NAFTA that, quote, this new global economy is our new frontier, close quote. And George W. Bush launched a global war on terror with the promise to, quote, extend the frontiers of freedom, close quote. After America's military failure in Iraq and its economic failure in the Great Recession, the nation's first African American president arrived in office at the precise moment when hatred was coming home from the fringes. With Trump, the first president since the dawn of American imperialism to renounce the Turnerian call for rejuvenation through expansion, quote, America finds itself at the end of its myth, close quote, Grandin asserts, and is finally being forced to confront, quote, extremism turned inward, all-consuming and self-devouring, close quote. The idea of the border wall has thus replaced the myth of American limitlessness, Grandin concludes, serving as a, quote, a monument to the final closing of the frontier, close quote. For all that, Trump's pledge to erect a, quote, big beautiful wall, close quote, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean serves many of the same purposes as the earlier expansionist rhetoric, The border remains abstract in the minds of most Americans, yet it represents a problem and a promise distinct enough to distract from more immediate and enduring social ills. A completed border wall and the victory it would represent to many is thus conveniently unattainable, allowing for the same fleeing forward that has always tugged at American history. After all, as Grandin shrewdly observes, quote, the point isn't to actually build the wall, but to constantly announce the building of the wall, close quote. If there is something missing from Grandin's study of the frontier, it is that the vast scope of his history leaves little room for readers to encounter stories on an individual human scale, to grapple with the more intimate effects of decades of militarism on the border. The rhetoric of the frontier has always had life altering consequences for those whose lives are thrust against its edge. But the fact that we rarely hear their voices in The End of the Myth is perhaps less Grandin's failure than it is the failure of the historical record to capture the voices, bodies, and places that have always had the least access to documentation. Much like McCarthy's Blood Meridian, corrective histories reveal the gruesome truths we have long been made to look away from. But they rarely show how violence is internalized by its victims or is lodged inside the collective memory of entire cultures, societies, and landscapes. To do so, the Mexican intellectual Sayak Valencia writes, quote, it is crucial to speak of the body, of the violence enacted upon it and suffered within it. Close quote. In the 2017 novel In the Distance, Hernan Diaz, who grew up in Argentina and Sweden, reverses the action of Blood Meridian. Set in the same historical period, the novel depicts a young immigrant who has become separated from his brother on the docks in Europe. He accidentally boards a ship to San Francisco, while his brother, it is presumed, arrives in New York. And so our stoic protagonist sets out eastward across frontier America, crossing the country in reverse, against an advancing tide of settlers, explorers, and outlaws. As expected, he is engulfed by hardship, drama, and violence. But when he finds himself in the middle of a McCarthy-esque slaughter of Native Americans, he is unable to soldier on like the hardened men of so many Westerns. Instead, he retreats into the wilderness where he hopes no human will ever find him and burrows deep into the ground. But even in his attempt to escape the violence of which he has become a part, the men he has killed stare at him in his dreams, and the rare utterances of his own voice sound monstrous. What makes the wall terrifying to so many who live along the border is, in part, the way it serves as an inescapable reminder of the brutalities and injustices that have long been unleashed upon the frontier. The very presence of a barrier represents a profound psychological, political, ecological, cultural, and spatial reordering. In Arizona, west of Nogales, the border wall bifurcates the lands of the Tohono O'odham people, who live on the second largest reservation in the United States. In an interview with the writer Marcelo Di Cintio, a Tohono O'odham elder named Ophelia Rivas speaks of how post 9/11 enforcement shut down the cross border pilgrimage routes of her people and led to the erection of border fencing and steel bollard vehicle barriers across their sacred lands. The year the barriers went up, Rivas says, quote, we lost 11 elders. One after another, they passed away. It just seemed they couldn't comprehend what was happening. Close quote. It was as if they had been poisoned, as if America had found a new way to take their land. A new way to take their land. At this point, Rivas begins to speak of her body, her hair. For Rivas, as for many native people, hair is intimately tied to heritage and identity. For the O'odham, the poet Ophelia Zepeda writes, quote, our hair is our dress. It is our adornment, close quote. When the walls went up, Rivas remembers, she had long hair. Each time an elder died, however, she would cut a length of it as an act of homage. Quote, by the end of the year, my hair was gone, she recalls. My apologies for the poor reading today. That was Boundary Conditions by Francisco Cantu. I'll, of course, put the link in the vid when I edit it out of the Middle Perch. This is a Middle Perch live on the internet, which is why sometimes my reading isn't great. I am MTK on the MIC. Today's piece, Boundary Conditions by Francisco Cantu, is in this week's New Yorker. Do yourself a favor and check it out.